Ella Stevens.
I'm Nico Photos.
I'm Stella Hallbauer.
I'm Alex Bialzik.
And today we're going to be talking about how racial representation has changed through time in psychological thriller movies.
We'll be examining how the genre has historically changed race and how groundbreaking films like American Psycho, Get Out, and Us mark significant turning points in centering minority experiences within narratives designed to unsettle and disturb.
When we think about psychological thriller movies like American Psycho, Get Out, and Us, we don't just see fear and violence, we see reflections of our society's hidden fears and biases around race and identity. So today we're going to be focusing on the issues of representation and in Hollywood thrillers and how it's changed and what they can say about us and why it matters.
For much of cinematic history, the psychological thriller stage was largely occupied by white protagonists grappling with eternal demons or external threats with a predominantly white world. When characters of color did appear, they were often relegated to the suspicious neighbor, the doomed victim, or the exalted other, rarely afforded the same psychological depth or central narrative focus. This created a subtle but pervasive issue of representation.
For decades, Hollywood has centered whiteness as the default, especially in genres like horror. Black characters are often killed off early, sidelined, or written as stereotypes. But more recently, films like Get Out and Us have changed that norm.
Representation isn't just about putting different faces on the screen, it's about whose fears are taken seriously and whose humanity is exploited, and who gets to survive in these stories. When it comes to thrillers, a genre built on fear, that's a big deal.
However, the genre has begun to see a significant shift. We're now witnessing the emergence of thrillers where racial identity isn't just a backdrop, but is absolutely central to the psychological conflict and the thematic core of the story.
So let's start with the question, how does racial representation in psychological thrillers shape and get shaped by the audience watching it?
In history, when black characters did appear, they were usually either sidekicks, criminals, or victims, never the complex central figure grappling with the horror. Scholars like Robin Means Coleman talk about how horror films are often othered blackness, treating it as some exotic or expendable rather than a fully human. When it comes to psychological thrillers, the absence is even louder. Movies like Silence of the Lambs, Seven rarely, if ever, featured black leads or explored racial dynamics at all. It was like the only fears that mattered were white fears.
Especially in the movie American Psycho, whiteness is definitely overpowered in the movie. Nearly everyone on screen is white, and when characters of color do appear, like the homeless black man Bateman kills, their background disposable and dehumanized, which ties into our central theme of issue of representation and racism.
To continue off of that, American Psycho is openly brutal but normalized, both in centralizing Patrick Bateman's wealthy white man whose privilege shields his monstrous behaviors. The film criticizes the emptiness of white capitalism, but it also reveals how whiteness protects, even glorifies, the violent elite.
Exactly. Minorities appear mostly as service workers. Bateman's victims include a homeless black man at one point, but these characters are one-dimensional. They just exist to reflect Bateman's power, and their deaths barely matter in the narrative.
The racial dynamics, or rather the lack thereof in any meaningful exploration, reflect a genre that hadn't fully yet grappled with the centering non-white perspectives in its exploration of the human psyche.
When you jump ahead to 2017, you have Jordan Peele's Get Out, which completely flips the script. Here, the fear isn't random, it's racialized. It's about what it feels like to be trapped in space where smiling white faces hide violent, dehumanizing intentions.
Jordan Peele's Get Out in 2017 was a game changer. It put a black man at the center of the horror, not just as a victim, but as someone navigating the terrifying reality of white liberal racism. The Sunken Place became a metaphor for how black voices are silenced.
Chris, the black protagonist, doesn't just face generic horror. He faces a specific kind of horror tied to racism and liberal hypocrisy. The Armitage family seems progressive. They brag about how they would have voted for Obama a third time, but underneath, they are literally stealing black bodies to preserve their own lives.
Get Out subverts traditional thriller tropes by placing a black character at the heart of a deeply psychological and terrifying experience directly born from racial dynamics in America.
Due to these factors, the default viewer of this movie is no longer white. The white characters aren't the audience stand-ins, they're the monsters now.
Jordan Peele said in interviews that Get Out was one of the most benevolent racisms. That's harder to spot than the kind that pretends to love you but still dehumanizes you. An audience got it. The film became a cultural phenomenon because it didn't just scare you, it named something black Americans had always known.
The film forces the audience, particularly white audiences, to confront the psychological toll of racism from the perspective of the target individual.
And it worked very well. Critics loved it, audience loved it, and it became a cultural touchstone. The phrase sunken place became a part of society.
And this was revolutionary for psychological thrillers. For the first time, a black character's fear wasn't a side plot, it was the plot. The horror was racism itself. Then Came Us in 2019, also by Jordan Peele. It's similar, but it goes deeper. It's about a black family not being haunted because they're black, but because of a broader idea that America creates an underclass and tries to pretend they don't exist.
While the film operates on multiple levels of metaphor and social commentary, race and systematic issues are undeniably woven into its psychological fabric.
Peele's cast a black family not just as the leads, but as complex, haunted, powerful characters. The horror wasn't about race explicitly, but it still subverted the norm by showing a black family in roles usually reserved for white actors.
Adelaide the mother literally has a dark double, but Us isn't about black people being attacked by white supremacy. It's about how everyone in America is implicated in systems of oppression. The Wilson family are victims, but they're also privileged compared to other groups of people.
Us utilizes a black family at its core to explore complex psychological and social themes, further breaking away from the historically white-centric narratives of the genre.
This makes Us unique. It doesn't just fight for representation, it complicates it. It says, okay, black people can be the leads, but we also have to think about class, survival, and how society forces people into monstrous roles.
And the brilliance is that these characters aren't tied to a race in a stereotypical way. The Wilsons, a black family, are complex, relatable, and central. They're not sidekicks or comic relief. They are the protagonist and antagonist, which is rare in Hollywood horror.
Which proves that being haunted by the version of yourself that society buried is one of the main themes of this film.
When we compare these films, the shift is clear. American Psycho ignored race. Get Out made race the heart of the horror. Us expanded the conversation to class and inequality without reducing its black characters to just victims.
By the time Get Out hit, all of this changed. The rise of social media movements like Black Lives Matter and a more diverse movie-going public meant audiences were demanding to be reflected on screen, not as side characters.
All of Jordan Peele's movies marked a seismic shift in the psychological thriller genre. The films center about race and specifically Get Out subverts traditional thriller tropes by placing a black character at the heart of a deeply psychological and terrifying experience.
These movies don't exist in a vacuum. Hollywood itself has long been the stage for these same power dynamics, where witnesses where whiteness is centered and everyone else is othered.
At the same time, though, representation isn't just about seeing black faces on the screen. It's whether those characters have agency, depth, and humanity. Peele's film forces audience, white and black, to rethink those whose here matters.
From the largely white-dominated landscape of the psychological thrillers exemplified by the movie American Psycho, we've witnessed a powerful and necessary evolution. Films like Get Out and Us have not only achieved critical and commercial success, but have also fundamentally altered the possibilities for racial representation within the genre.
This also makes Us unique. It doesn't just fight for representation, it complicates it. It says black people can be the leads, but we have to think about how other people will react in that situation.
By placing black characters at the center of intensely psychological and terrifying narratives rooted in racial dynamics, these films have opened up new avenues for exploring fear and anxiety on screen.
This factor further proves that representation isn't just about casting, it's about perspective. It's about whose fear gets taken seriously.
The shift is significant because it allows for a more nuanced and authentic portrayal of the psychological impact of race and racism. It moves beyond simplistic stereotypes and allows audiences to experience fear and suspense through the eyes of those who have historically been marginalized or misrepresented.
And that's the power of representation in thrillers. It shows that fear isn't universal. It's shaped by history and society, by identity, and the more complex our stories get, the closer we get to the real truth.
All of this not only enriches the genre, but also offers a powerful tool for social commentary and understanding.
Today, thrillers aren't just about personal nightmares anymore. They're about collective fears. Fears about racism, inequality, and in the American dream itself.
However, the journey towards a truly equitable and diverse representation in psychological thrillers is far from over. We need to continue to see more diverse creators behind and in front of the camera, telling stories that reflect the full spectrum of human experience and the myriad ways in which identity shapes our fears and anxieties.
The evolution from American Psycho to Get Out to Us shows that Hollywood can change. It can tell richer, harder truths if it listens to new voices and embraces real representation.
Ultimately, the power of psychological thriller lies in its ability to tap into our deepest unease. By embracing a wider range of voices and experience, the genre can become even more potent, reflecting a more complex and nuanced understanding by the fears that truly haunt us as a society.
Going back to the sunken place in Get Out, like the sunken place we talked about earlier, is a metaphor for Black Americans being silenced and marginalized in society, which just furthered the growth of racism in thriller movies.
That's the twist these films bring. In Get Out, the psychological thriller is rooted in the everyday experience of black paranoia. The fear isn't irrational, it's survival. Chris senses something is wrong, but he's gaslit by white liberalism until it's almost too late.
Metaphors such as the sunken place and psychological thrillers are fairly common. They use them in a way to represent and hint at a bigger overall message and theme of the movies.
Yeah, talking about overall, like, if you look at thrillers and horror films before the 2000s, you'll notice a pattern. They're overwhelmingly white, like movies like Psycho, The Shining, and such, like brilliant films, but they barely introduce people of color, and when they do, they're normally played as minor roles.
Exactly. In that way, American Psycho is less about a descent into madness and more about how madness thrives behind polished suits and white-collar privilege. It's a psychological thriller that critiques the very structure Hollywood often glorifies.
And I think it's important to understand the impact that social media's uprise had on all of these situations, because in a sense it kind of made psychological thriller movies like more aware, and they started acknowledging the systems that produce fear more, like racism, capitalism, and the media, and not just individually pathologically influencing something on their viewers.
Well, yeah, and we can clearly see a significant shift in how race is represented within psychological thrillers. While earlier films often relegated minority characters to the margins, contemporary works like Get Out and Us place them at the center, using the genre to explore the unique psychological dimensions of racial identity and the anxieties born from systematic racism and social othering.
Going back to social media, it gave audiences a voice. It exposed Hollywood's lack of representation, called out whitewashing, and demanded accountability. It also helped elevate directors like Jordan Peele, whose story resonated with people who hadn't seen themselves accurate on screen before.
So the question is, where do we go from here? Representation is improving, but Hollywood still has a long way to go. Not just in casting diversely, but telling deeper, more complex stories.
I agree. These films are not just entertaining thrillers, but also powerful forms of social commentary that directly address issues of racial representation and power dynamics within the genre as a whole.
Thrillers like Get Out, Us, are proof that centralizing marginalized voices doesn't just make better representation, it makes better stories. And horror at its best shows us that just not what we fear, but who we fear becoming.
And now, audiences expect complexity. They want racial identity treated as a multifaceted, not just trauma-driven. They want thrillers where black characters aren't just victims, where they can be heroes, villains, survivors, unreliable narrators, and something in between. That's what Us did so well. It didn't rely on race as a plot device, but it didn't ignore it either.
And with the rise of social media means audiences have more power than ever. We can uplift the right stories, call out harmful ones, and demand better. But we also need to think critical, not just about who's on screen, but why they're there and how they're being portrayed.
I also think social media is a great point to bring up because there's so much influence with social media this day and age, and I think that we can do so much with that influence. And a lot of the times we're not using the influence we have in the best way. And I think changing our perspective on that could make a big difference in this topic, especially in representation of racism in anything.
Yeah, I really agree. But even prior to the 21st century, psychological thrillers often operated within a framework where whiteness was the unspoken norm. Characters of color, when present, frequently serve specific, often limited narrative functions. They could have been the initial victim that sets the plot in motion, the suspicious outsider whose motives are immediately questioned, or a source of exoticism or danger. The psychological complexities and internal struggles were almost exclusively reserved for white characters. And that's prior to the 21st century because a lot has changed throughout the history within racial representation in psychological thriller movies and just in the film industry today even.
I think that also kind of talks about there are a lot of thriller movies that are political, and I think that a question a lot of people have should thrillers always be political, because there are so many other issues that are more important to talk about, like racial representation, which that can add into politics, but at the same time I think we focus too much more on things that don't matter as much.
Right, and even a common theme in today's world is politics is being brought into everything, and I feel that being said, in movies that are trying to portray a message of racial representation, I feel it can often be overlooked due to the huge topic of politics.
I agree. I think some of the best thrillers are political, but I also think that it's because there's real fear in politics because of how much of a chokehold it has on society.
And to build onto that, with politics comes power, and with power comes money. And I think something that the film industry realized is that representation, especially when it comes to racism, isn't just a moral imperative. It's a good business, because Get Out's budget was $4.5 million and it ended up grossing over $250 million globally. just due to the fact that they represented racism in their film, and then to build onto that, Us topped that $250 million gross income.
Yeah. Well, to conclude, while films like Get Out and Us represent important milestones, there are still countless stories to be told and perspectives to explore. We need to continue to see more diverse creators behind and in front of the camera, with telling stories that reflect the full spectrum of human experience and the myriad ways in which identity shapes our fears and anxiety as a society.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it is really important to consider all of the stuff that we've talked about so far, and I appreciate everyone listening to our podcast and how much we wanted to talk about racial representation in psychological thriller movies.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.